Today I'm going to show you some ways of getting some really nice clouds in your watercolor and acrylic paintings. And some of the examples will be wet on wet, some's going to be wet on dry. This is an example of actually wet on dry watercolor. This is wet on dry as well. This one has a combination of wet on wet and wet on dry. And this is the acrylics. Clouds are typically a lot easier just because of the consistency of the paint. Watercolor, sometimes you have to account for drying time and that sort of thing. Now if you're a beginner, a lot of times what I suggest is that instead of free painting, that you do a very light, and I don't know if y'all can see, but there's a light pencil outline of the shape of the cloud. A lot of people say, well, I don't know how to make cloud shapes. Tape's coming off here. And my advice to that is take photographs of clouds, print out a 4x6 copy of it, and then sit down with your paint and paper and the photograph and try it freehand. If you can't do it freehand, then try to outline sketch just the outer part of the cloud, and then you can get a really great cloud that way for those of you who are like brand newbie beginners. Now the trick with making great clouds with watercolors is the brush. You want to use these rounded end watercolor brushes. They come in different thicknesses. I use the bigger one, the number 12. I'll use that for mostly the background, and the smaller ones for more close to where the cloud is for the detail and the outlining of it. So wet on wet is basically where you put water on your big round brush, and you're going to do the opposite of what you're normally used to doing. You're going to do the background first and let the cloud stand out. So you want to leave the cloud the way it is. So I'm going up to that pencil line on this one cloud on one side, and I'm using a lot of water. This is a wet on wet technique. It does require quite a bit of water. And I'm outlining the top of the cloud with this water, so I've got a nice wet surface. Okay. So I'm just coming around that way. Now then what I'm going to do is, keeping it really wet, pick a shade of blue that I want, whether it's, a darker blue. And in my watercolor pan, I'm making it very wet. In other words, it almost has like a little puddle of paint in there. And so while the paper's still wet, make sure that you roll your brush. Let's see if I do. You roll it around like this. Roll it in the paint. So when you come to the paper, you got a nice little point. And I'm only touching the water part of where. Now, if you're not sketching it out, you can do this freehand by just putting it on there. Now as you notice with the wet on wet, has this very pastel-y, real soft sky look. And I'm just coming up to the edge of where I want that cloud to be. Most of the times I will use a mechanical pencil to do the very faint outline of a cloud.
You've got mail.
Or a hard graphite sketching pencil, because you want it to be a very fine line. You don't want to put a lot of pressure on your paper, because then you'll be able to see that line once you put your watercolor on it, and you don't want to see the line. And that's my cat. So I'm going to come down to I call it my horizon line, where the background is going to be. And as you can see, hopefully, you can see where it's dark right up to where the cloud is, and then I'm going to pull some of that back with the brush still wet and the paper is still wet. And that makes a nice soft sky behind it. It also takes away that harsh outline of blue, unless you want to have a harsh outline of blue next to it. So whatever you want it to look like. Okay. Sometimes I'll leave a little dark spot in there to kind of like indicate maybe it might be a rain cloud. And that's wet on wet. Without messing up the cloud is still there. And I can see it better. And it doesn't really look like a cloud. It just looks like a white blob right now. So the way you get the look of the layers of the clouds, and this is where a photograph comes in real handy, which I don't have one, but I've meant to get it at the store. So I've got my brush, it's got a little bit of paint in it. And I'm going to add a little bit of water to it. So now I'm going to do wet on dry. And the wet on dry is just, I'm going to make indications of where parts of that cloud might be deeper than others. Or layers, if you want to call it that. And so now you can see it doesn't look flat anymore. And since I don't have, you can do a watered down blue. You can do this with gray. If you want to make it a rain cloud, do a little bit of gray on the bottom. I didn't have enough water in my brush for that. And you can give the indication that eventually it's going to rain. Like that, by putting a little darker bottom on it. You can come up further in it, because a lot of these, we call them flat bottom clouds, where the bottom will be totally flat, but it'll be gray, which indicates rain. So you can do clouds like that. And like I said, you just make indications of where you might it be more recessed. The rest of it's going to catch the sunlight. You can do it on the edges if you like. And so that's a wet on wet with a little bit of wet on dry. Now the wet on dry is the paper is wet, and I'm going to get a lot of watercolor paint on my brush, and I'm going to outline this cloud with it. With that, I don't know if you can see the really tiny point on the end. Can you see that? Well, it's super. It's just like a hair, like an eyelash almost. And I'm using that as my drawing tool. So I'm going to draw around this one with a little darker blue, just to show you the difference between wet on dry and wet on wet. Great thing about watercolor, while it's still moist on the paper, you can pull that color across to darken an area that you want to darken. And that's what I'm doing. Just pulling it across. I'm going to grab a little bit more of the watercolor paint. Wet on dry. Finish outlining this little blobby cloud here. And go around. So wet on dry, you have more paint, and as you can see, I can take what I've already done on there and just kind of pull it down, as long as it hasn't dried too much. As long as it's fairly wet from being first put on there, it'll stay like that. So that's wet on dry. You can see the difference. This is very light, so this would be great for lighter skies. And wet on dry, it's going to be darker, and so I'm going to water down my brush so that I can put some indications of depth in this cloud. And I'm just kind of randomly going through it. Now if you don't like, if you think it's too wet, you just take, I have a piece of cotton cloth, polycotton, and I just take the excess moisture off. So you can kind of see where I put those little spots in there. They don't really make a whole lot of sense because I would actually kind of connect a couple of them because clouds they cap more than that as far as layers goes. So this is wet on dry, the whole thing just wet on dry. So there's two different variations that you can hopefully see, where this is wet on the paper was dry and this the paper was wet. Now that's with going around to sketching. To do a freehand one, that's where you have to decide, do you want your sky to be light or do you want it to be darker to show the cloud off. So I'm going to go with the dark just so that you can see it better, and we'll see what kind of results I get from that. So I'm going to do wet on dry. I'm going to use a different shade of blue. And what I'm going to do is all the areas I want to be the cloud, don't put any paint, just so do the reverse. So do the outline of the cloud with the blue. And this is a freehand cloud. So I'm still practicing on freehand clouds. So, but if you do it in this way, so that's a freehand cloud outline. And all I did is, with these, I don't use the point as much as I use the side of the brush, because I want to be able to smooth that out away from it. I have not added any more watercolor into this brush. This is still what was left on there from doing that outline. And so this way I have the cloud stands out and the sky stays kind of pale except for right around the cloud, so it kind of like pops off the page. And then from there I can either give it, you know, the bluish kind of highlights, or sometimes you'll see a little golden glow on the edge. But the key with that is that if you're going to make this where the sunshine is shining on that cloud and it's giving that little gold outline or a colored outline, you're using blue. So if that yellow, you want to make sure that this blue is dry, completely dry. Okay. So I'm just going to give some couple of spots where I think would show kind of, and this is wet on dry. I'm not using a whole lot of the gray. If you don't have gray in your palette, you can always use extremely watered down blue, because gray is actually derived from blue. And so I'm just kind of like giving the indications of a dimension in that cloud. So you can see the white ones. Now if this had some really dark spots, that's where the point comes in handy, and you just go in there and do another layer. And where you're doing wet on dry and you want to increase the intensity, you have to wait for it to dry and then put it on top of the previous spots. So I'm giving this a couple of darker areas for that. So that's a freehand cloud, which sometimes mine turn out good, sometimes, you know, I end up fiddling around with them. I'll take another layer of blue and just put it on top. A lot of people say they have problems with layers. Well, the key to layers is let the previous one dry. If you don't let it dry and you're trying to, okay, now here's a good example. I had too much paint in my brush for that spot. So what do? I put water in my brush and I pull it away from it before it starts drying. Okay? And you do the circular motion, and a lot of times that will help get it out of there. But I can use that to my advantage. I can make just a part of the sky just a little bit darker there to mask it over, and so it doesn't really show up as much. Now since this one here is dried, because it was just not a whole lot on there, instead of using the wider brush, when you're doing details in the clouds, minute details, you want to use a smaller round brush. I actually have a little liner brush that I use. It's got a really long brush head to it, but it is also, this one dried a little. There it goes. And so you take that, and whichever color you want to do that highlighting with, and this is going to be like a lemon, I call it a lemon yellow, and then literally again, roll that brush in there so you get a nice fine line point, and we'll say the sunshine comes from here, and it's going to hit this cloud right about there. So you want to get right on the edge, real, just the one side of it's going to have this glow to that. That's where the sun hits it. And then it stops. I don't know if you all can see that one, but here's the yellow outline. So now it didn't turn green. If this was still wet, that would turn a green shade, and you don't want green clouds. At least I don't think you want green clouds. So, and so I can do the same. This one below is actually basically dry. And so with where that sunlight's coming from, I've got some yellow here. Can y'all see that? And now you can see it. We just did that little bit of yellow. And to make that make sense, all you need to do is put your sun in. And you put your sun in over there. I don't need to use a liner brush to do it, but since that's one that's in my hand. So then that would make more sense. The sunlight hitting those edges of the clouds. Now this one here, above it, because it's above it, the sun is going to show that gold on the bottom, not on the top. That little highlighted yellow from the sun is going to be actually on the bottom. So you want to make sure that it makes sense where your light is hitting the clouds. Like I said, these aren't my best clouds. This is just to show you wet on wet, wet on dry. Now the acrylics, that's another story. It's a more full-bodied paint, and so you can go crazy with acrylics. At least I know I do. And I usually will get a couple different shades of blue, just a dot of it. And then there's the white for the cloud part. I have another blue here somewhere. Thought I did. Yeah, I do. It's just a little shade different, not much. A little lighter. Okay, and I usually put the blues and the whites, right close to each other. Come on, get out. There we go. Let's see. Let me get this white out here. Now, if you want a really heavy pigmented acrylic type painting, this is how you would do it. You would use the paint directly from the tube, not diluted. The great thing about watercolor is you can dilute it and make it work like a watercolor. You can mix it with watercolor in your paintings. You want a spot that gives more richer flavor of color, and you can use the acrylic with the watercolor to accomplish that. So when I go to do the acrylics, you want to do the blue part first. At least that's what I do. And the darker blue. Now see, my brush is wet from having it in the watercolor, so you can wet your brush if you want. But what I like to do is put in the dark part first and just kind of mess around with where a cloud's going to be. And you'll see why in a minute. See, that's a really bright blue, almost a turquoise blue. I'm going to take this other blue, just close to it, almost the exact same color, actually. And kind of, some spots I'm going to leave more white than others, and that's because when I go to add the white for the actual clouds, I'll be able to have a two-tone effect. So this is acrylics without being diluted. And right now it doesn't look like a whole lot. But then you go and snag up some white. And while this is because the acrylic doesn't dry immediately, and go in there and just start doing random areas and just grab a little bit more white and give you some light spots in the sky. Because you're gonna, and then start with the white here in the white and then come meet up with the blue, and that gives you a whole different look. Now I'm just doing clouds. When I use my acrylics like this, I'm using circle motions. See, circle, 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 circle. Okay. And then what happens for this effect that I like to do is the white going into the other shades of blue creates a depth in the sky. Hello, Whiskers. That's our new adopted tuxedo, and her name is Whiskers, and she likes to get my attention. She thinks it's time to eat, I guess. So I'm going around to all those spots where it was just white and meeting the blue, grabbing a little bit of it, and then coming down. So I'm making another shade of blue with the white without doing it out actually in the palette. So I'm going to take another spot here, this little spot. And what I like to do is I like to do a whole piece of paper like this, just through the whole thing as a sky, and then bottom half will be the sky reflected in the water, and the other is just a sky. Okay. So I'm just literally doing circles around here. Now I need to make where I want my clouds to be. And so I want to get all of that blue out of the brush. And I'm going to use the smaller brush to do these clouds because I want them to kind of be more distinct. So I'm going to take the next brush down that I have, and this is a 4. I think this is a 4. Actually, it's a 6. And then I'm only taking white. And the brush has no water on it whatsoever. And that's how, then I'm going to shape my clouds. I'm just going to shape them in here. And what's nice about doing it this way is that while the acrylic underneath is, trying to dry, you actually get the depth of the cloud from it bleeding through just a little bit. And you can also get some nice crisp edges as well. So, put this up. So, as you can see, it gives you that real crisp white edge that you see in the sky, but then you see the darker inside where the light is showing you the depth of it. I'm going to take this white and I'm going to go down here to this spot because I see a cloud hiding there. And again, I'm just doing circle motions. I'm circular because these are poofy clouds. These are not flat clouds. These are the puffy kind, or cotton ball kind, I call them. And so I'm doing the little cotton ball swirls in there and covering up where the two blues were meeting each other to give me more definition in my clouds. And it's little circular motions just like this. Just like this, come over here, and sometimes I see a second cloud like hiding behind one, so I'll leave some of that blue and I'll make more white come down and meet it, and then come below it and put in another one. This is how you get your layers, your stack or stacked clouds, I call them. Sometimes I call them that. But as you can see, hopefully, there's a bright spot there, and then you can see where there's bright edges on, looks like 2 other clouds with some of the blue coming through. So this is more likely what, the kind of thing you would see. And so I'm putting a lot of paint on this paintbrush on the tip because I want it to be kind of thick to be able to show off all the colorations underneath. You can put little squiggly ones in there. Everywhere where I have put a lighter blue, and then there's this really dark blue near it, is where my clouds are. So I'm kind of like placing them up there to be picking out on the then I'll show you something you can do also like this. So the circular motion keeps them fluffy. Hello, Whiskers. She's crying again. Instead of adding gray to this, you're pulling out the color that's beneath it and using it as your accenting gray. This is really turning out better than I thought it would. Now this is a very thick, bold kind of representation of clouds. You can soften this by doing it diluted. Now as you can see, it's just circles. I left some dark blue. Now if I want to change that blue because it looks kind of muddled, I can do that. But how I do that is rinse out the brush that I have and keep using a smaller brush for detail. And I'm going to take it and I'm going to go over that blue with just some water and just kind of soften it just a little bit. I mean, I love the color of it. It's kind of a peacock color. But I don't always want to have that stark blue look right there. So I'm putting some water on there. So now this is a wet on dry with acrylic. And take one of the blues, water it down, and work it in. So I'm just going into these spots where it kind of looks like you can still see the pebbles of the paper, or the texture of the paper, and just kind of smooth it out in those spots. Just with some watered down paint, with the acrylic. Have a nice bright spot over here. This could be my water down here. If I wanted to do it that way. Sometimes that real dark blue just needs to be lightened up some. So you add water to it and you do that circular motion and you pull some of that paint up off of there. I'm going to show you a little, because like this corner was really dark, okay? And I'm going to take, you can use a paper towel, you can use Q-tips too, and just pull some of that off. So now it's not as vibrant, but it's still a nice dark blue. And you can do the same thing with watercolor. If you get too much pigment on it, you just pull it up off of there. But I'm trying to soften these places where you can see the brush strokes. I don't want to see my brush strokes in here. So I'm taking water and doing the circular motion and smoothing them out. Now what I can do while that is wet, so now this is going to be a wet on wet kind of thing with acrylic, is take a little bit of white, mix it in with that watery mixture, and go back and cover up areas that are really super dark. We're just going to I'm actually just blending it into it. So when it dries, it'll lighten it up. So I've got this lighter hue of blue that I'm incorporating into this sky. This is kind of, I call it a peacock sky. So there you have an acrylic sky that was straight paint from the tube to the paper. This was wet on wet, have dry on wet. This is a dry on wet, but with more paint in the brush. What you can do as far as learning to know how to do certain effects with your brush is really key. If I take the light blue, but I load it up on my brush for the watercolor, for the dry on wet for here, sure I've got a lot of water in there, yeah. And I come up meet to the edge. If you tap it, which I call it puddling. If you can tap it like this, it's almost like doing a Monet, where he did dots. And so you're just puddling pigment into the paper. And when you do that, you're going to let that, it avoids from doing a bunch of layers, but you do have to let it dry. Really dry before you go to the next step. So I'm going to grab some more of that same light blue. Nice little puddle of paint in the tray. And then I'm just going to go right up and just touch to that, and leave a really dark collection of paint. Now that yellow had already dried, so I can go ahead and do this blue behind it. I don't know if you can see, but what I'm doing is exactly this. I'm taking the brush, and I'm kind of like pushing it down onto the side and letting it puddle, or make a little puddle of color, but when it's flat. It works out better if it's flat. And that way, I'm not having to make a whole bunch of layers. I'm actually doing my layers at one time. Now, I don't know if this is right or wrong, but this is the way when I want to make sure I have more vibrant colors in a watercolor, and I'm using the pan watercolors instead of the tube. And that's another video. Is that I'm going to use this puddling technique, I call it. Because when you do that, instead of sketching it out, it's almost like you're sketching it, but you're actually doing it in dots. Okay? And you can change your sky look from this look to this look just by having it full of paint and dabbing it. Now, as it gets dry, if you do it with less water, you can actually get another effect of shading your sky out. So what I'm doing is I'm pushing it down on its side, and using that point to come right up to where the cloud is, and then you have a softer sky, but it's darker. See, this is really super dark. Now I could, take some of that out. And the way you take it out is, since it was puddled in there, you puddle it out. So you put a lot of water on your brush, and you come up to it, and you pull it away. You pull it away. Just pull it out. Where it's dark, pull it out away from. Just like this. Pull it away. You can see it getting lighter by where the cloud is. And you can add a little bit of pressure, and your brush is actually on its side, and you're pulling it out. Just like this. Pull it out. Get it wet, pull it out. Get it wet, pull it out. And that's how you can pull the color away from it. If it's too dark in here, get your brush good and wet, put it on its side, and pull it away. Pull it away. Okay? So now you're going back to wet on wet, basically. So I go back and forth from wet on dry to wet on wet, depending on what kind of effect I'm trying to get. This with the acrylics, you can do a lot of detail real quick just by using a thicker paint. Now, doing acrylics watered down for a sky, you basically can use them just like watercolor. So this method is wet on dry, but it's with a lot of water with acrylic. So I can take this and do a whole area really fast for more pastelish kind of sky. And if you do it not super wet, you can even get those light spots in there that you want to put clouds into. They kind of like will poke out at you. So I'll show you a soft acrylic sky. See, I'm getting my brush really wet, going into a little bit of the acrylic paint and going straight to the dry paper. And because acrylic is a thicker paint, you can do the white on top of it and not lose it and lose the look of it. So I can go in now and make sure this is cleaned out. No blue in there. Get some white and just do a cloud or two. So I'm going to go. And it picks up some of the blue because the blue is still wet. So it's going to pick some of that up. And I like doing my skies in acrylic like this a lot. They're more subtle and softer. But I've got a good bit of paint in here, but I'm not adding any water to the white paint at all because I want it to stand up against the blue. And sorry, because I'm doing this sideways. Let me turn this around so I can have it at my left-handed angle. And this way you're actually putting in, what you're doing is you're highlighting the cloud after the fact, okay? And the blue background becomes part of the cloud. In other words, it's putting in those cloud layers for you. So then all you're doing is going in and putting in the parts you want to have like bright. Just little areas that you want to highlight. And sometimes you can take your brush, this is the 4 round one, and lay it down, and then lay it down again, and kind of like go over the spots, some of the spots in the blue, and let them show through, but then also show that you have other layers going on with this cloud. So I'm going to go over here to this guy here and leave some of the blue, but then put in the layers of the white. This one you can't see as much because I haven't highlighted it. Highlight it, you just put a nice thick layer of the white. Or if you wanted to do a soft white cloud, add water to it. Add water to the white just like you did with the blue. And I'm just going to put the indication of a small one right here. But then you can't really see it because it blends in, just like with watercolor. So when you go to do the clouds on the acrylic using the watered down acrylic, the blue part is watered down and the white is the thicker. You don't put any water really on it because you want it to stick to the layer below. And then you know, if you wanted to create the water at the bottom. And you can do this with watercolor as well, is using a wet on wet technique, even with the acrylic, is wet this paper good. And then take that watered down blue, stick it in there. This is a wash with acrylic. So you're putting that blue down there. Make sure you define your horizon line there. This is going to be a landmass, so I'm just going to block out that white for appearance's sake. And I want to make darker indications in the water for depth. Just come across in different, and while it's wet, this really looks neat. And this is the same as you would do with watercolor. So, utilizing that nice little point on the tip. I mean, it's very subtle. But then you've got, you can put your water in below. You want to put your clouds in there, reflect in there. You go back. And you don't use the white paint as thick, but you do use a lot of it. So there's a cloud there, so I want a cloud to kind of like be reflected in the water down here. The more prominent the cloud is in the sky, the more prominent you want it to kind of like show up in the water. And you can take it and just add a little thicker water down there, but I mean white in the water for the cloud, but not a whole lot. You just want to see, okay, there it is. It's reflected. And just like so. I don't know how well y'all can see this from there, but if you look at something like this from a distance, there's a cloud reflected, there's a cloud reflected. Okay. Now this is acrylic side, but if I wanted to do a water wash of watercolor over here, I can do that. Now the trick with a wash with water, and if you want reflections, is the best way I can tell you is get your brush real wet, and do it in stripes. So in this case it would be, because the bottom's always going to be darker closest to you. Sometimes you have to do it in a layer. Okay. Then you want some white spaces, so you're going to leave those alone and do this wet on wet or wet on dry. And kind of skip spots. So that way it looks like there's different levels of water. Well, hello, Miss Whiskers. Whiskers, are you going to paint? You can't eat that. That's paint. That's paint, you silly girl. You want to get down off the table? Thank you. So, and then as those wet parts dry, because someone asked me, it's like, well, how do you get, to see the horizon line? I said, well, you have to do it in layers to the point where you're doing wet on wet basically, but if you do wet on dry for the foreground, then you get more of the darkness to it. So if I were going to put in a horizon line here, I'd want to do it with like a gray, just because those clouds come really low. I have mostly sky and not so much land or water mass. So so when you're doing your watercolor and you want to do water, you can do it wet on dry. Just do straight paint on the paper like this, or you can make it wet to give it a more softer effect and let that dry, skip an area and leave it just dry white paper, and then do your next color and do it in strips or stripes, whatever you want to call it. So I can put in a where is this? Like an island back here, I guess. I'm gonna make this an island. That's it. It's gonna sort of bounce off the light of the sky. And come across. Get a nice little turquoise line there for where the water is. And I'm going to have two. Now using that little, I call it that puddling effect, you can get a lot of interesting details put in. You know, I can take this sort of green looking island coming out and just darken it up. Take some brown or black and just kind of add that to it underneath, because you know there's going to be a line of soil or dirt that's going to meet the water. For something like that. So I just added in, you know, that. Yes, this is watercolor and this is acrylic, but mixed medium sometimes just works. So I hope this helps for those of you who've been wanting to do clouds and you're kind of scared of them. They're not so scary. Just my suggestion with on it is when you're wanting to do some clouds, this one is all watercolor, is with the wet on wet, which is how this one was done. I just skipped over certain areas and left them white. And the dots, those are done with masking fluid. I wanted to have a starry kind of sky. And you just do little dots of the masking fluid, paint everything over it, and then you just rub them off, and then you end up with a really cute picture. Hopefully this has helped you all out. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. And like and share my videos. And hopefully this has helped a lot of you with your fears of getting over the clouds. This is Crafty Sue. See you next time.